Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good day to everyone watching us after the live stream. I'm Nicholas Lorimer, your host, today joined by Dr. John Endres. John, how are you doing?
All good, Nicholas. Thank you.
Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick, John, Hermann. Doing well, thank you. Looking forward to our discussion today. Quite a bit for us in 2025 to talk about.
Indeed. And Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you doing?
I am well and glad to be here, and I must say, I'm looking forward to hearing to listening to Chris and John's analysis. So thank you for having sort of an in-studio audience member. I'll mute myself now and then just observe and learn.
I think we're all here for the same reason, Hermann.
Yeah,
I want to know what you guys think.
Yeah, I may have to.
Yeah, I want to know, did something happen this year? It seemed to be quite a year.
Well, about that. So, John, in the pre-show discussion, you suggested that we sort of do a survey for the year of our economy and our politics, and that is indeed what we're going to be doing today. So let's start off with the economy. John, I guess the bottom line is, the headline question here is our economy actually starting to look up? And if so, why? Has there been actual policy change from the GNU? What are these reforms we keep hearing about at ports with the rail? Is Eskom unbundling ever going to happen? Is this all just because we've only had, I think, 1 or 2 days of load shedding in the whole year? Is the sun coming out and the future looking bright and sunny? What's your take?
Yeah, so I do think that the economy is actually starting to look up. So it seems that we are seeing a reversal of the very bad track we've been on for the past 15 years or so. But an important question to ask as a follow-up is, by how much is it looking up, and for how long will it look up? And that's really going to be the key question for the next few years. And I think we'll get into a discussion of that as we go along. But for this year, it seems that we might be on track to triple our GDP growth rate, which was 0.5% last year. So we might come in this year around 1.5%, maybe plus minus a couple of percentage points, which is great. But that does pose the question of by how much. And we would say, I think at the IRR, probably also Chris at the CRA, that 1.5% is to be welcomed, but we're not shooting the lights out yet. And we do need to shoot the lights out because the problems our country faces are so grave. And that means what we need is a growth rate that is closer to 4%, 5%, stretching even higher than that if we can achieve it over the next few years. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, you start off by saying we've tripled our growth rate, and then you say to 1.5%, and there lies the problem when you're talking like about a anemic European economy that analysts are worried will not be producing, not be able to maintain its economic dominance. They often start talking about 1% growth rates, or less. And if you look at France, there's all this internal thing. Oh, we're only growing at 1%. A country with so much untapped potential, lack of development, etc., like ours, should be growing at 3 or 4 at least. And if we got the policies right, it should be growing much higher than that, maybe 6, 7, 8 even.
Yeah. So maybe before you move on from that, Nick, just a useful rule of thumb for the viewers and listeners to know is the rule of 70. So if you divide 70 by your growth rate, you get the number of years until the thing you're looking at doubles in size. So if we want our economy to double in 10 years, we need a 7% growth rate, because you do 70 divided by 7 equals 10. So at a 7% growth rate, we double the economy in 10 years. And that's kind of what we want to be looking at. That's the kind of growth that starts getting unemployment down into the single digits over the course of a decade or decade and a half. And that is the transformation that South Africa needs. Nick.
So, Chris, as to my question on reforms and stuff, why do you think things are turning around? If, granted on a small level, but this is certainly in the right direction. What do you think's driving this?
So markets and investors, if there's one thing they love its stability, political stability. So the fact that the GNU has held, from a perception point of view, has helped the JSE, helped our listed companies, sort of South Africa Inc. It has helped in that regard. We also had some attractive fundamentals in our fiscal and sort of financial space. So to give credit to the Reserve Bank and Minister of Finance, his deputies, if you look at us getting off the grey list so quickly, that kind of work, it doesn't just happen by accident. People need to implement the kinds of steps that the financial action task force would require for us to be removed from the grey list. So on the one hand, just the very fact that the GNU has helped from that.
Can I just say, on the Financial Action Task Force and the grey list, did you see the list of other countries that came off at the same time as us?
Mm-hmm.
And when you read that list, you go, this is really not like, the fact that we were on that list to begin with, I think is not very encouraging. You see other countries, I think South Sudan was also taken off the list at the same time as us. And to look at the countries that are on the lowest level of financial, that the Financial Action Task Force has, I think it's very few. It's like North Korea and Iran. So this is not so much, this is like keeping your head above water, just able to get oxygen. It's not exactly being able to swim.
That's been the case for many businesses in South Africa for the last 15 years, I'd say. It's more just surviving and not thriving. So just keeping your head above water, not really being confident enough in the economy, in the policy or legislation space to invest more capital into the country because you're sort of concerned about where things are trending. So just to go back to the original point, on the sort of political stability has helped. Also, just the uncertainty emanating from Washington has made some emerging markets more attractive. So that doesn't mean we've fixed our our weak growth fundamentals, or we've reformed massively to strengthen property rights, or gotten rid of race-based legislation in public procurement, or any of that kind of thing. Just relative to the instability that is emanating from some places in the world, we've looked somewhat more attractive. And just the last point on this, Nick, before I hand back to you, in that uncertainty, when there's more questions about things like the dollar, your commodities do well. They do better than beforehand. And South Africa, again, benefits from that. We don't export as much as we should be doing, given our ports and our rail, but we've benefited from higher commodity prices this year. To me, that could give our government a bit of a sort of easier way out and say, look, we've got 30% tariffs from the US, but our growth rate is still picking up. We're collecting more revenue. SARS is doing well. All that kind of thing, but it's not getting us to where we should be. So I think, some domestic and some global factors have played into our favor. But South Africa over the last, let's say, 25 to 30 years even has benefited from these commodity cycles, these upswings, where we don't fix our fundamentals, but then every few years, something plays in our favor globally and things look good on the surface, but the fundamentals haven't changed. So time will tell if this is again going to be that case, if in 3 to 4 years, 5 years time, we're again at the low point of our growth cycle, sort of below 0.5%, or if we're getting some of those reforms right. That means if the commodity cycle turns downward again, it's not just that's sort of keeping our growth rate and our revenue collection buoyant.
So Hermann, I'll come back to you more for the politics stuff, but I don't know if you have anything to add on where our economy is at. I keep trying to, and maybe John also has some comment on this. I keep trying to bring up all of these reforms I hear about sometimes. The fabled Operation Vulindlela, there's talk of reform at ports and things. If you read like sort of official government documents or business leaders from the sort of mainstream representatives of big business, you hear all this praise for these initiatives, and that's the claim as to why we're starting to see a bit of a turnaround here. I think Chris's explanation is more applicable, but it can be both.
Chris mentioned the word buoyant, and I think that's really sort of an interesting word to look at and apply to the South African economy over the last 30, 40 years, going back into the 80s, perhaps even into the 70s, where we often sort of hear this two narratives that are both sort of removed from reality. Number one is that the ANC came in and started wrecking an economy that was firing on all cylinders in the 70s and the 80s. The other story that we hear is that everything is going so well. And what's really useful to appreciate of the 1970s and the 80s, and actually the whole apartheid era, is that the South African economy was really not attractive to investment. When it was growth, it was erratic growth. And quite often you would have these massive year-on-year jumps in terms of GDP or GDP per capita. So it wasn't really where an investor would go. And if we appreciate that an economy's health is measured on how many people choose to put their money to work in this theater of economic risk, then we should appreciate that the apartheid economy wasn't a good one in many, many ways, but particularly from an investment perspective, not just the boycotts and the sort of the real geopolitical drama surrounding apartheid. It was just not a very stable economy. It was much more of a roller coaster. Now, the problem is that the crisis we've had in the last 20 years isn't a roller coaster economy. It's just a boring economy that sort of really doesn't go anywhere upwards. And the word buoyant is quite interesting because the Asian commodity boom 20, 25 years ago allowed the South African economy to be buoyant and to really ride a wave. And in a way, as a rule-taking economy in the global game, that's sometimes the best you can do, at least as you get your ducks in a row, hopefully over longer term. But what was interesting about the buoyancy of our economy 20 years ago compared to today is that we could see more positive buoyancy questions. We weren't just keeping our sort of nostrils barely above the waterline. We got 4-5% annual GDP growth in the mid-2000s because of a relatively buoyant economy. Now, of course, there was the sentimental benefit of coming out of apartheid and not going into an immediate sort of typical African post-colonial tailspin within the first decade. But the buoyancy that we had compared to the buoyancy that we have today is sort of a tragic comparison. That there was a time when these waves that would opportunistically help our economy do well could help us do even better than we are currently. So that's the first point. And the second point is sort of in one of those famous lines from a witness in court in the Profumo affair, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? So when the government comes out and claims everything is hunky-dory, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And that's where I think this year has been quite educational for me personally, is to really, in trying to understand the economy, not just understand it, but communicate what the IRR wants to do in terms of policy and what economic growth means, and really sort of trying to understand what the story of economic growth is, not just the facts and the spreadsheets. You should ask questions like, is economic empowerment allowing someone born in Attridgeville today to become a member of the middle class in 20 years' time? Are we seeing businesses choose South Africa above other competitors? Our investment, presentations to these global events, are they based on sentiment, on promise, or are they essentially based on delivery and production? And that's something that is really sort of irked over the last 10 years, particularly, is when we have these investment get-togethers and South Africa has to make our pitch, especially in the world of mining. You would quite often see almost a touristic advert for South Africa, is that we've got the spirit and the story and this vibrancy, and where other countries would just come with hard figures. Other African countries would just come with hard figures of productivity increases, taming inflation, market access, and so on. So it's one of the things that John and I spoke about a lot this year, is that it's a step in the right direction, but it's nowhere near far enough. And we've seen a lot of that over the last year and a half, is that it's been a step in the right direction on many fronts. The involvement of the private sector in infrastructure and ports. Yay, more of that, please. So the story, I think, of the GNU is thinking in the right direction, or perhaps even a few steps in the right direction, but not nearly far enough.
So, John, if you look at our episodes over this year, we start off the year, things are pretty rough. I mean, we've got the Expropriation Act coming in. It looks, when we have that big fight over the budget, like things aren't going to stabilize. A lot of really kind of negative stuff, the policy environment. And since then, while there've been some small wins here and there, while there's been a lot of shift in like the debate, for example, on BEE, in terms of the actual laws, things really haven't changed that much. So were we wrong when we said that, this stuff was all going to be really bad for our economy? And look, things are looking up. I mean, maybe they're not going great, but they're better than they were a year ago.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's, I think, one of our concerns is that, getting to a 1.5% growth rate is going to be used as justification by our political class and our big business class to stop thinking about further reforms and say, the setup we've got now is obviously the right setup because we've got the 1.5% growth or the 2% growth. Let's stop there. Let's just, keep doing what we're doing. And that would be a very bad mistake to make. And why is it a bad mistake? Because of the scale of the problems the country faces, with unemployment being, the number one issue that our respondents mention when they get asked what the two biggest priorities are that the government should be addressing. Jobs is always number one. There's a priority on that list which, doesn't even get mentioned, but it certainly animates the government types, and that is the public debt and public deficit, public finances. How can the state, manage with the money it's got? How can it achieve better results? And even that answer, a positive answer to that question, depends on economic growth. So a fast-growing economy has upstream and downstream benefits. In public finances, the downstream benefit is that your tax revenue increases and the state has more possibilities of paying down the debt, using the money it collects to accelerate economic growth further, to improve the lot of South Africans. So that's positive. But there's an upstream benefit to economic growth, which is that to get it, you have to start doing things right. You have to start protecting property rights. You have to start treating citizens equally and not discriminating against them based on race. You've got to start introducing accountability in the political system, in the business sphere. You've got to start addressing crime. So you've got to do a whole set of things properly to get the economic growth, which you desire to have for all the benefits it provides to you downstream. And in that context also, I have this sneaking suspicion that the stars might be aligning for South Africa. We as Hermann has pointed out, we've managed to ride on the coattails of global commodities booms, sometimes better, sometimes worse. But we also have the opportunity to do more than just that and to start charting our own course and not be dependent on what goes on in the rest of the world by doing the right things. And here we might have the stars aligning in our favor in the sense that in the United States, I think we're going to see a looser monetary policy and fiscal policy into the future. I don't think that there's going to be austerity in the United States. I think there'll probably be rates cuts. And I think the preference of the Fed, the Treasury, so the government in general will be to let the economy run hot and try to get the employment labor market as tight as possible and accept that there's going to be some inflation in exchange for that. Because that inflation will be helpful in reducing and melting the value of the debt stockpile that the United States currently has, which our viewers point out, sovereign debt is an issue across the world, exactly. And certainly the United States, it's an issue. So inflation is going to be one solution to that problem. South Africa is moving in the other way. So as the United States, I anticipate, is going to be accepting higher inflation, South Africa has actually lowered its inflation target and seems to be getting its debt under control. And so we are behaving in a counter-cyclical way, which I think makes South Africa appealing as an investment destination, especially in an environment where in the United States, if quantitative easing takes off and rates go down, there's going to be a lot of money sloshing around looking for places to grow and to be invested. And we should be making our pitch for South Africa to be one of those places. On a recent trip to the United States, I spoke to somebody who works on the Hill. We were talking about the testy and fractious relationship between South Africa and the United States currently. And I said, what I'd like to see happen is an investment frenzy to occur around South Africa. I want investors to be falling over each other, trying to get into South Africa because it's such an exciting opportunity. And this person I spoke to said he shared that view. And I think, he spoke for himself, but I think he also speaks for US politics in general. I don't think that they mean us harm, but I think they're impatient, and they're not indulgent with us. They don't want to indulge us with our local preferences for anti-growth policies. So they're saying, just put in place some pro-growth policies. We're going to be there. We want you to grow it. Go and do it. That's your opportunity. And of course, in relation to Europe, I think South Africa also has that opportunity, because it seems to me that the European continent is stuck in a low growth environment, which I think they're going to battle to come out of, because of an older population, a preference for preservation of the status quo, and a very high tolerance for high levels of regulation, which I think stifle innovation. Back to you, Nick.
So I think we'll come back to the US stuff just now, because there's stuff to be said on that. But let's get into the politics and how it's changed this year. So the beginning of the year was really sort of stacked. I'm just looking at the titles of some of our episodes, and we had, in the same week, we had Ramaphosa stabs property rights in the heart was the title of one episode. And the next day is the ANC spits in the face of the GNU. So there was this sort of really rough start to the year when it looked like the GNU was really in chaos. The DA looked like it kept being rolled. And then we had the big budget fight. Hermann, what do you make of how the GNU is doing now at the end of 2025? Has the DA been fatally compromised and absorbed into the NDR agenda? Has the ANC begun to reform in an interesting way? Is there something in between those two poles? What do you think?
Yes, so those are quite a few charged questions. No, I don't think the DA has been swallowed into the NDR. In fact, if we are to look at by-election results and opinion polling, our own and that of other entities like the SRF, the DA seems to be in a position that they've never been in before, where they have a floor of support probably above 25%. And that's really never happened before. I think in the history of South Africa, where you have a party like the DA, Liberal Party, a free market party, at least, within the broader spectrum of South African politics, that's quite a useful development. Now, to give you some context as to why we shouldn't let our history muddle our appreciation of the situation, is that in the UK, currently, the Reform Party, Nigel Farage's Reform Party, is leading in the opinion polls with about 31%. The Conservatives are and Labour are in a tight sort of duel for second place, around 22%. And then you've got the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, sort of mid-teens, upper teens. So if we appreciate the fact that the DA has gone from a party that really sort of struggled to get to 23%. In fact, it's never gotten 23% in a national and provincial election, to now being within a few points of the ANC on the right side of 30, and you compare it to the fact that the Labour government in the UK are currently polling lower than the DA is polling in South Africa, it gives you some context to appreciate how the politics of South Africa have shifted. And I think the budget debate will probably go down as the most important political moment of, probably the 2020s, whatever time frame you want to put on it, it's going to be a massive event. Because what is astonishing is when I got those results, of our polling at the time of the budget debate in April, May, exactly when the issue was heating up, the most important takeaway for me from the political data was that the DA had gone from 5% of Black support in September, October 2024 to 18% of Black support during the budget debate. Now, I was initially quite depressed about the fact that I thought our budget data or our polling data was so contaminated by the uniqueness of the budget moment that I thought it wouldn't have any, longevity, and how wrong I turned out to be. The DA seems to have stabilized around that point, with the most remarkable change is that they have managed to grow their support from Black South Africans to 5%, from 5%, between 4 and 5%, to a consistently 15 and above. Now, if only Black South Africans could vote in a general election, the ANC would be the biggest party, and then MK, and now the DA would be in third place if we only had a black democracy. If you take that into consideration, that there's the IFP, there's the EFF, and then there are also other further radical parties, then for the DA to reach that point and keep, I think, a strong language on low taxes, strong language on economic growth, decent pressure on corruption, by no means a ringing endorsement of the party or its leadership, I think it becomes very, very difficult to argue that the DA has been captured by the NDR. If we understand how much the NDR has hurt the ANC, from being a 70% Mbeki era party to being a 37% Ramaphosa era party, and the thing that changed the most in that period was NDR dial twisted up to 11, then I think it's difficult to conclude that the DA has been captured by the NDR ideology, especially given that its support has risen, and that its policies, flawed as they might be, still, I think, remain close to the moderate middle, with a preference for free markets, investment, and jobs, the good stuff. The ANC, I'll try to keep this short because I do see I'm wittering on. The ANC, I don't think, has really changed remarkably. I think that's the most remarkable thing, is that they've had no real remarkable shift. That this is a party clearly panicked, still unsure about why it lost its majority, pretending that its majority is sort of waiting to return to it, if we are going to go on the words of people like Tokodidiza or Fikile Mbalula, and a party that has to promise its most valuable electoral asset that they won't remove him from office this year, and that he might serve out his term. Now, whether you like Cyril Ramaphosa or not, whether you think he's a good president or not, he is the most popular politician in the country. He is the ANC's most likely valuable electoral asset. And yet this is a party that couldn't negotiate the political headwinds to appreciate that if you are uniting the capitalists and COSATU against a tax rise, perhaps it's politically damaging to try and enforce it. And the only thing that prevented the ANC from doing that is a DA and EFF court challenge. If the party doesn't have the political dynamism to even respond to as glaringly blatant warning signs from a political dashboard as the VAT issue threw into their faces, if they have to sort of promise their greatest electoral asset that they won't remove him yet, if they pretend that the majority is just sort of waiting for the ANC to be on a ballot again so that they can re-endorse it after making sort of a petulant point in 2024, with no real reform on substantive policy, with a doubling down on the NDR this year on at least 2 occasions that I'm aware of, with calling the GNU a holding pattern or a tactical retreat in order to safeguard the National Democratic Revolution, then you have to come to the conclusion that the ANC really hasn't traveled in any direction in terms of understanding why it has gone in 20 years from a 70% party to half that. And then a last point on the GNU. People ask me, has the GNU been a success? Well, it's like sort of asking whether an angle grinder is useful. Not if you want to mow a lawn or sort of do your pedicure, but if you want to sort of do some real industrial work, fine. And in that sense, the GNU has been a political success, even if it hasn't been a policy success. Politically, it has moved the country from a very particular set of politics or state of politics and game of politics to a new one. So politically, the GNU, I think, has been a success. I think we've seen some maturity creep into the system if you compare the medium-term budget policy statement to the budget and how different those two experiences was, where the one was sort of bounced onto cabinet and the other one had a sort of an away day that seemed quite moderate and successful and pragmatic. So all in all, policy, GNU, I don't think much of a muchness. I think sentimentally nice. I think there have been some good shifts, but politically, the GNU has been, I think, a very, very good indicator that things have really changed and that we aren't going back to the politics of the last century where single party dominating was just the assumption. And that changes how parties make promises going ahead.
So I think, I mean, it's quite interesting. I think the GNU, because as was very clear on this podcast, I was extremely anti the coalition government initially, because I really was worried that the DA would be sort of swallowed up by the ANC and just kind of pushed along. And I think there was danger of that at the beginning, but what's kind of happened now is that it's managed to maneuver itself into this interesting place where it is both in government and also the opposition at the same time, which is in a lot of ways the best of both worlds.
And which is what Ramaphosa did for the entire first duration, for his entire first term, is he was the president opposing the ANC.
Yeah, exactly. Chris, just your thoughts on that. And also, we have this question of why the ANC is so against sort of changing the ways of doing things, even as sort of all the lights on the dashboard are flashing red, as Hermann said. We had a speaker this year who was speaking to us at an internal thing who said that Ramaphosa's analysis of the election was that, well, look, we've lost support to the EFF and MK, and therefore we've only lost support to the left, which means we need to go further left, and that's why he's doubling down on all these NDR things, which sort of superficially, I think there's some sense in that analysis, right, if you just look at the numbers. When you look at the underlying sort of attitudes of South Africans and how much the ANC was being given, I guess, one more chance, in my view, by a lot of people, that seems to, in my opinion, be exactly the wrong thing to do if you want to maintain electoral support.
Can I add one word to that question to Chris? Not just attitudes, but frustrations. Misreading the frustrations of South Africans.
Chris?
Look, even more than ideology, and we can talk about how different individuals in the ANC, some are more committed to the NDR than others. More than that, as the party continues to decline, because it built up so much in terms of access to state resources and how that then feeds into the party. We see now again reporting over the weekend for the fourth time this year, the party has failed to pay employees' salaries. Given how they've built this patronage network through the policies they've pursued, it doesn't surprise me that they cling more and more to any kind of vestige of power. So if something like the GNU is useful to just sort of kick that can down the road, I think they will continue to do that. They're sort of very expedient in that kind of way, and good at exploiting those, apt at exploiting those opportunities. I want to touch on what Hermann mentioned around the sentiment of the GNU and how we shouldn't discount that for South Africa, for the economy, but also maybe the sort of legacy of the GNU should be seen in terms of it's almost managing the death march of the ANC. And is it done in a constructive way? And is that energy used positively, and what comes out of it? Or is it done in a way that the sort of very worst inclinations of the ANC lash out as the party continues to be under pressure? Again, if you look at the construction mafias, water mafias, other forms of patronage, all of it comes back to ANC influence, preferential government contracts, state contracts, all that kind of thing. So you see the manifestation thereof, I think, into 2026, into the next local government elections, and 2027, of course, the next ANC leadership race, leadership conference. Hermann touched on the ANC having to give assurances to Ramaphosa that he won't be, he won't be asked or forced to step aside. The party, of course, this week goes into its next National General Council. So from today until the 11th of December. And the fact that your most attractive individual from a sort of political sentiment, electoral point of view, has to receive these assurances, I think tells you quite a lot in terms of the sort of state of mind in which the party finds itself. And it can't find the sort of the moves necessary to get itself on the better path. Sorry, just a last point.
To be fair, I think that this buzz about removing the leadership of the National General Council happened at the last National General Council, which I think was in 2019 or something, which I remember exactly. There was the sort of anti-Cyril Ramaphosa faction was all going to the media and saying, we're about to take him down, we're going to call for a recall for all this. And then nothing happened. So I wonder how much of that is happening this time as well.
But I think that is the point. It is showing that this party isn't politically serious.
Right.
It could also, I mean, okay, maybe I'm giving too much credit here. I'm trying to play some 4D chess, but maybe it's a way. So if you're Ramaphosa, those aligned with him, you spur these rumors to see who aligns against you, who runs with those and who don't. How can you sort of set up the camps going into 2027 to sort of game it in that way? But that's me, imagining that they've got the sort of they've got the camps on the battle on the board on the table, and they're trying to figure that out. Nick, I'm gonna finish on this point. The strife with the US, I think the ANC sees it as very beneficial. It's going to lean into it even more next year because they think it's going to translate well in an election from a sort of grievance victimhood point of view. So despite some of the pain to the economy, maybe even targeted sanctions coming in at some point, the ANC, I think they're so still desperate to remain that sort of moral superpower as a liberation movement, not a political party, but a liberation movement. They're very happy for the rhetoric from Washington to continue in sort of adversarial sense towards South Africa.
So on that point,
Nick, very, very, just very quickly add there
only
something.
If it's very brief.
It's very brief. If this sort of guarantee of withholding regicidal instinct were to be in isolation, I think it would be fair not to see it as a red flag. But we must remember that the biggest faux pas of the year politically was Ramaphosa telling thousands of ANC councillors that they can learn from the DA, who often governs better than they do. And Gareth van Onselen said a very interesting thing to me and John, that you can spur on a team with the successes of your rivals if the team has self-belief. But if you try to do that with a team that is psychologically not in a place of any self-confidence, then you animate your team against the messenger. So I think that psychology of the ANC is what should be read with this, we're not going to kill you yet, Mr. Ramaphosa promise.
So, John, the thing I just wanted to say was that on this question of, and through your answer, I think we can start transitioning to some of the international discussion here, but on this question of legitimacy and defending the national interest, the ANC, as Chris suggested, might try and basically play the nationalism card, right? Look at us, we're defending the country from these foreign adversaries, from the US is just trying to be mean to us, and AfriForum and the DA and whoever else is all trying to undermine South Africa, and they're controlled by foreign capitals and all that. But you look at the kind of just legitimacy crisis that seems to be going on, and I think the McClunga Commission is really big in this sense, is that it really undermines the legitimacy of the ANC, just as a sort of governing party. I think trying to then claim that you're the true defenders of the people while all of this stuff is coming out about how everyone is connected to every other Tsotsi in the country, it's not a strong position to play the nationalism card from.
Yeah, so this was a discussion I had with Hermann, where I said, it seems to me like the ANC is heading towards electoral oblivion, or some kind of a terrible disaster that will befall it slowly, but that's the path it's on. And he asked, what's the mechanism? So what makes the ANC sort of break in the end? And my thought here is that what it is going to be is it's a question of belief. So how much do other people believe in the ANC as being the epitome of moral authority, the leader of the nation, the designated embodiment of the spirit of South Africa. That's number one. And the second belief is the self-belief. To what extent does the party itself believe that it is capable and honorable and respectable enough to lead the country? And I think these two beliefs are draining away at the same time. And that is ultimately what is going to sink the ANC if they don't find a way to reverse that. Right. So they've got to find a way to start believing in themselves and to get other people to believe in the ANC. At the moment, I'm not really seeing a way that they are doing that because that would rely on producing results. And that is something the ANC is not really doing, except maybe for the 1.5% growth or something like that. And, still being in charge of the GNU. But what we're seeing it doing at the moment, I think, is leaning on easier to achieve targets, like, for example, fighting the US. That's not so difficult to do. You can sort of sell that quite easily. Or you try to lean on other things like national dialogues and so on to animate South Africans around the notion of unity and kumbaya. But that also isn't working. And also with Hermann, we also discussed that it seems to us that the ANC seems to be losing competence. So it's finding it harder and harder to get difficult things right. Like, for example, reading the political environment correctly, drawing the right conclusions, deriving the right strategy on how to respond to events. It's showing more and more missteps. And I think that will continue happening because of the lack of belief by others and belief of itself in the party. So this competence question, I think, is going to be really important. Maybe just a final note on that. Over on the Common Sense podcast, James Myburgh had a really good explanation of the balance of forces theory, which explains how the ANC sort of looks at its environment, scans the environment, and then assesses whether the moment is opportune to push ahead towards the national democratic revolution or to pause in its advance or maybe to retreat tactically for a while. The ANC has been very, very good at doing that for 30 years. But at the moment, I have this concern on behalf of the ANC that it doesn't have the skill to do that very well anymore. So its scanning of the environment is not accurate. And the conclusions it draws are also not accurate. And that is a threat to its future electoral sustainability. And this decline, I think, that plays out over time. I think in a recent risk alert, Chris and I called this the slow toppling of the ANC. It's a very big tree. It takes a long time to fall over, but it's in the process of falling. Nick?
So I'm pretty convinced that after the next leadership conference in the ANC, whichever side loses that will split off from the ANC and try and do their own thing. John, do you think that's likely?
That I don't know. I mean, like, people keep asking me who's going to be the next leader of the ANC. I don't know. There's a few candidates on the list, but I have this sneaking suspicion that it won't matter very much. Depending on how quickly the ANC goes down, it'll be like, so okay, it's Mashatile or it's Lessufi or it's Mbalula, but like, who cares? Ultimately it's just sort of the ANC continuing along its path, but not really playing that much of a role anymore. It's sort of just continuing by sheer force of inertia.
Can I quickly add something on that? It's just to understand why the ANC's internal cohesion forces are weakening. It's because the patronage networks are weakening. Two things united the ANC over its term as a government: electoral success and patronage networks that can be counted on. They are losing both.
Mm-hmm. And also achievements to point to, right? To say, like, we delivered on whatever X is. We've been successful in doing the thing. The G20, I think, is the last thing that they've sort of tried to sell as a success, but it's not that impressive. If you look at President Ramaphosa's comments, or was it the foreign relations minister, sort of highlighting compliments from visiting heads of state, but none of those were substantive, right? It was sort of, people were very friendly. The organization was very professional. What are they not saying? Was it productive? Were any important decisions reached? There was none of that. It was all around sort of the hosting, which is nice, but short.
And what I think will be very ironic is that the G20 will probably end up costing the ANC a lot. Number one, it's taking the national dialogue global. So it's the international dialogue where it's just sort of talking. What did it do for ordinary South Africans? But I think what will what will absolutely shine in its absence is the momentary experience of police presence and service delivery in Johannesburg
Yes.
that will quite probably become a
Right.
reminder to ordinary people that if the ANC wanted to, they might have done actually something
It's the
better.
hope that kills you, not
It's the
not
hope
the
that
absence.
kills you. And it's that loss of hope that the ANC has now introduced into its own bloodstream by actually, for a moment, having the basic surface level markings of competent government, at least in parts of Gauteng, and then suspending it the moment the last plane left.
So just one last point, just the ANC's sort of coalition potential with the EFF and MK. I think there's one, the patronage network might be another big reason why they haven't gone that route. I wrote an article back in November of 2022 about how the ANC and EFF struggle, despite their ideological similarities, to be in coalition with each other because they so ruthlessly compete over the patronage network. The moment you let these other guys in, you really have to divide up lunch essentially with them. And if the party is being held together by patronage, that's not a great recipe. That's exactly the way that these other parties can steal your lunch. Okay. Let's move on to the world. Let me start with John, and then we'll go to Chris. John, I think the most overused phrase this year is probably something like new global order or something to that effect, right? The world has changed. America is changing. Multilateralism is gone. Tariffs, all these things. Lots of think pieces have been written, lots of documents, trade negotiations, drama. I wonder, though, I was thinking the other day, is this all being a bit overread in some ways? I think the US is definitely having an internal conversation very loudly, and also, while it's pretending to have this conversation with the rest of the world about its place, it's actually having it with itself. And the Trump administration has identified a much more definitely a different viewpoint of the world than the previous American administrations have. But has the American public really actually moved on a lot of these questions? If you look at polling of how Americans view the world, you find that support for engagement with American allies, support for tariffs is pretty low. Support for weapon sales to, for example, Ukraine is actually, I think, the highest it's been. So is this actually the way forward, or is this sort of a momentary thing being driven by the fact that the US is having this internal conversation with itself?
Yeah, I think this might be one area of discussion where we disagree a bit more with each other than we do on many other topics. But I do have the impression that we are seeing a kind of resetting of the American role in the world. I think it represents a rupture from the past. I think it is very disruptive to the US and to the rest of the world. And I think it emanates both from domestic politics, but also from a reassessment of the US, of the US's role in the world by itself. And effectively what it is the transition from a unipolar world order, which we had after the fall of communism, to a multipolar world order. There's other countries that are competing almost at an eye-to-eye level with the United States, or maybe at an eye-to-eye level, like China. And this means that the United States cannot afford to claim the role as the world's sole superpower anymore. And that's a painful realization and experience, I think, for the US to go through, and also for the rest of the world. We've all become very accustomed to this idea of the US as the world's policeman that, sorts out trouble wherever it arises and can deal with any problem anywhere in the world, project force globally, prevail in any conflict. That's not true. I don't think that the US could beat China in any meaningful sense of the word. And that is something that the US is realizing now. And I think it is also realizing the cost of trying to assert that role, which it can no longer fulfill. And that is a cost to American taxpayers. So we see lots of talk about, why are we sending American tax dollars overseas for X or Y? And American taxpayers are resisting that. So that's what's happening at the moment. And I think it is a process filled with uncertainty. I think it is anxiety inducing in the United States for US allies, for US rivals, because everybody's asking, like, what comes next? How's this going to play out? What is the role of the US going to be? What is our place in the world as, Germans, or as the EU, or as South Africans, or as China, or as Taiwan? Because nobody now knows quite where they stand, because that hasn't been decided yet. And emerging from that, also this topic of nuclear weapons. That is something that was very front of mind to us who are old enough to remember it, which on this call I might be the only one. The fear of nuclear holocaust. That's something that was a real thing in the 1980s. Where as a child you grew up thinking, okay, maybe there's going to be a nuclear winter, maybe we'll wipe out the human race, maybe by mistake, through an exchange of intercontinental ballistic missiles between the Soviet Union and the United States. That was a real fear, and that went away after the fall of communism and non-proliferation. And we thought we lived in a new era. But now that the cards are being reshuffled, it may well be that nations which are not top-tier nations like China and the United States realize that if they want to be prickly enough not to be attacked by one of the larger powers, they need a credible deterrent, and that may be nuclear weapons. So we might see a much greater spread of nuclear weapons throughout the world. I could well imagine South Korea, for example, being interested in getting them, Japan being interested in getting them, Poland or Germany being interested in getting nuclear weapons, just to deter the regional hegemons from trying to mess with them. So it is a slightly unsettling state of the world that we confront at the moment, and I think it will continue to be unsettling for a while. Nick?
So so nuclear, for reasons I won't go into because it's a discussion for another time, I'm not particularly worried about nuclear wars, and I don't think I ever will be. That being said, I just want to, before I come to Chris, I just want to get your response to this. There's an argument to be made that the US is still very definitively the unsurpassed hegemon of the planet. Most military metrics, it still far surpasses China. A lot of China's military strength is completely unknown. China has no extensive military experience in any modern conflict. In years, their navy is untested. We've seen the US military in both its high points and its low points, but it's been used quite a lot over the past few years. And if you look at, for example, US expenditure as a percentage of GDP on the military, in 1990, they were spending 5.6%. That goes down to about sort of 3-ish during 2000. Then 9/11 happens, it goes up to about 5 again, and now it's back down to sort of 3 again. And I think it's projected to be actually below 3. The US doesn't seem to be trying to compete for global hegemon status. This is not, but this is not. This is a political choice. It's not sort of a thing of incapacity, which I think is like, why is the US choosing a multipolar world when it is still the dominant power? It's bizarre.
Well, I think, I mean, that's a great question, and I think the reason probably lies in the intersection of politics and economics. And a useful thing to always think about in large-scale questions like this is the trade-off. So you gain what at the cost of what? And I think for the United States, that trade-off calculation doesn't make sense to them anymore. So they would say, yes, we could spend 10% of GDP on our military if we needed to. Our economy is large enough, and that would allow us to build a credible force projection in the Western Pacific, for example, or in Europe. But what's the benefit? Being global hegemon or sort of the promoter of a liberal world order, sort of freedom-oriented world order, is that really worth it? And I think at the moment the Americans are saying that's not really worth it. That's too expensive. We don't want to do it. We don't want to sacrifice American lives. We don't want to send our tax dollars overseas. We got to focus. We've got a very nice continent here, North America. We're going to make sure we control that. And South America, we assert the Monroe Doctrine. It's not going to be that expensive. We make sure that in our area everything is fine, and the rest of the world must kind of sort itself out. I think that's the conclusion they're arriving at the moment. Is my sense.
I think there's two more things to be said on this before I come to Chris. Sorry, Chris. One is that I think it's very strange for the country that has by far the most. Let me put it this way: when British strategists were looking at the world in 1900, they were terrified because they said we're at the top. The only way is down. If anything changes, it's more likely to make us go down, not up. And so it's very bizarre that the US, which I think does sit at the apex pretty much of all these global institutions, to say, actually, screw it. We're going to change everything up and see how things are going. And this is why I think that things might be overread. I mean, I don't know what I think everyone is kind of talking a little bit as though the sort of MAGA coalition is going to be the perpetual view of US politics. Even if, for example, J.D. Vance becomes the president in the next election, he's going to have a different, what I think is actually probably going to be quite a different foreign policy from Trump's. For example, I think he'll be far less supportive of Israel in general, which is something that Trump has been very supportive of. So we don't really know what the Democrats think. I mean, if they win, I don't think they have at all anything like a coherent foreign policy vision to sort of match the Republicans. But that doesn't mean that one won't emerge in the next couple of years. So, US internal politics, I think, still has a lot to sort of shake out as to what America's consensus on foreign policy is. It's currently going through some sort of change, but what that change will result in, I think, in the end is too early to tell. I think that's and so we shouldn't take now as being too much of a projection into the future. So, Chris, let me come to you. Sorry, we've kept you so long. What do you make of the way the world is in at the moment? I mean, do you think that there's going to be some sort of slowing down of global trade? How do you think things are?
Not what else I can add. I mean, the global economy has held up surprisingly well this year. There has been some price increases in some sectors and some areas, but global trade, given since sort of COVID and the lockdowns and then the Suez Canal crisis and what that did to global trade, you've already seen a sort of not complete reshaping of global trade flows, but there has been some surprising resilience. If you look at the Cape, the routes around the Cape, for example, in terms of numbers, it's the 7th most important. If the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal were closed for any reason, the Cape route would become the 2nd most important, that just from a volumes point of view. So we've got some redundancy in that regard. I think you'll continue to see that. You've got your developed economies like the US, Europe, China has got lots of domestic growth constraints and concerns. So I don't foresee them really being the growth engines for the next 5 years or so. It's going to be up to some of the maybe what we call the middle powers like India, many of the Middle East countries, Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and then countries on the African continent, and not South Africa, unfortunately, just yet, but countries like Rwanda, Kenya, Ghana, maybe the Ivory Coast as well, where they've done relatively well to handle their debt burdens. And now we need to see if they get some of their sort of growth fundamentals right so that they can get some of the investment that comes to them as it pulls back from places where growth sort of declines somewhat. So, yeah, I don't think it's the end of globalization. I think it's a bit of a rejigging, as it were, global trade, and especially for countries to trade with China. It's just still, it's too affordable, it's too easy, it's too cheap to integrate yourself with Chinese manufacturing and supply chains, despite concerns about sovereignty and all that kind of thing, just from a cost benefit analysis. It's to most countries' benefit. So I think many countries will continue to try and do what they can to mitigate any potential high tariffs from the US, but more and more, I think, just from an economics point of view, try and integrate with China for the time being. So let's see if South Africa also does that. Maybe just the last point here, if we think on the South African US front, if we think things are tight or difficult between South Africa and the US under Trump, just wait for someone like JD Vance or Marco Rubio to take over. I think they're more focused, they're more ideological, and South Africa could be in for an even more difficult time when it comes to US relations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Things can always get worse, as they say. So, Chris, I believe you have to leave us now. So, no worries. Hermann, you've been telling us in the private chat here that you don't want to participate at all in this discussion, but I think that's not wise. Your thoughts on all the stuff we've been chatting about?
Well, you're making me look so respectable as an analyst here. Thank you, Nick. No, I must say, what if we're going to bring this back to the South African situation, it is, in theory, there should be a great time for non-aligned countries. If you consider that we've got a multipolar tensions rising, politically, economically, geostrategically, then, quite honestly, this is the perfect environment in which non-alignment would have been a constructive and sort of a quote-unquote patriotic policy. If you look at, I think, countries like India, really probably the model of foreign policy success over the last, at least since the start of the year in terms of the Trump era and
the other one is probably
Ukrainian
Turkey.
conflict. Yeah, I possibly I'm going to take your word for it. I don't know enough to disagree with that.
There's a joke that some analysts have, which is that doesn't matter what happens, Turkey always wins. And I think that's overstating it, but there's something to be said for that.
What makes it both an opportunity and a frustration is that South Africa's foreign policy has, and this is, I think, there might be some disagreements on some elements of how we got here and where we go from here. But from every American source that I've spoken to or that I've engaged secondarily with through people like Chris or John or yourself, Nick, it is quite clear that South Africa's perceived non-alignment is fooling no one. And the ANC's foreign policy problem is that it isn't getting the benefits of anti-American alignment at the same time as not getting the benefits of real non-alignment. So it is playing the foreign policy situation in terms of the South African-US relationship is just stacked against us due to our own inability to position ourselves either as an ally, an opponent, or a true non-aligned country where we could have leveraged our status, our timeline, our territorial waters, our coastline.
It's worse than that, I think, which is that
we've got all the negatives of being an anti-American country with none of the positives.
Yeah, I agree with that analysis completely. But to make it even worse, the Europeans right now are kind of desperate for friends around the world now that they're getting suspicious of the, things are not going so well with the US. They don't really like China that much because of all the authoritarianism and Belt and Road stuff. It's kind of worried, and obviously they're concerned about Russia. So the Europeans have continued to be unbelievably friendly towards South Africa recently, and we're just not answering their phone calls. We're leaving them on red for the most part. I remember there was some function that happened recently. I think our former colleague, Mlondi Mbluli, who's now the DA MP, was telling us about how there was some sort of trade commission talk with between our parliament and some European diplomats. and the ANC and MK connived to make sure that the DA speakers couldn't say anything, and spent the whole time just wanting to extract things from the Europeans. I mean, to say that our foreign policy is self-destructive is probably understating it. John, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the observation is correct that the Europeans are quite interested in working with us, and I think we are interested in working with them. But it is kind of
they are our biggest trading partner, right? If you take all the
Yeah.
EU countries together and then also add the Brits, I know they're not in the EU anymore, but like they're sort of in the same block. You know, they're by far our biggest partner, but no, we're far more keen on cozying up to China.
Yeah, and I think sort of this sort of flirtation with the Europeans, the mutual flirtation, I call it a mutual consolation society. You know, so the Europeans have had their toes stepped on by the United States, and we've had our toes stepped on by the United States. So we cry on each other's shoulders, which is endearing, but I think not hugely impressive. And I do fear that the Europeans, as wealthy as they are, and I think they're 10 times as wealthy as Russia, for comparison, with a population of probably 500 million. I think the Italian economy is probably bigger than Russia's economy. They're clearly very important, but the sense of dynamism is lacking from Europe. I think that they find it very hard to identify a joint course of action because of the unanimity rules in the EU.
Right. I think that's the biggest problem with the EU as a bloc, is that inability to sort of have a majority viewpoint that kind of sets policy is just absolutely fatal for it trying to act as any sort of power. You know, you just literally one country, and it's usually Hungary, can just sort of say, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah. And this, you know, here the state of conflict with Russia might become interesting, in the sense that if the Europeans have any sense, I think they must realize that they need a far higher degree of coordination if they want to prevail and be effective. And if they do find that, then I think Europe, you know, certainly will be a globally very important player. But if they don't, then there'll be sort of a bunch of lots of wealthy older people shaking their fists at the sky. That is, you know, not great. And I'm not sure which way it's going to go yet.
Just to illustrate that point of how, you know, you need a united program of action, I was listening to something where they were talking about why some politicians in Norway, who were very, very pro supporting Ukraine in the fight with Russia, didn't want to spend more money. And it had nothing to do with Ukraine. It had to do with the fact that the Norwegians apparently were saying, and, you know, once again, I don't think they're in the EU, but they're, you know, sort of in the same political bloc. No, but if we spend too much, then these other countries will slack and they won't spend what they should be spending. And it's that sort of mentality that really needs to be overcome if Europe wants to actually like act.
It's the geopolitical tragedy of the commons. It is quite,
right, exactly.
quite astonishing.
Europe operates not as a coherent force, but more as a sort of group of crabs in the bucket, desperately pulling each other down anytime anyone tried to escape. And I mean, I think the Germans under Friedrich Merz are interested in changing that. Whether they actually have the ability to, I think, is a very different question. Your thoughts about it?
Well, I think like the incentives are badly aligned, right? Because any one country that tries to claim leadership is immediately going to be opposed by all the others who don't want one country lording it over them. So finding a route to, you know, more centralized control, command and control, is going to be very difficult. But it may be that the Russian threat is the thing that allows them to do that. You know, if something serious happens and they realize, well, we can't continue mucking about like this, we actually need to be serious, maybe they will do it.
Yeah, at the moment there seems to be, and who knows whether it'll change, but at the moment there does seem to be broad alignment between the UK, Germany, and France, which, you know, historically speaking, is not really a common phenomenon. In theory, that should be able to do things, but even then, you still see cracks. Like, for example, they're like, okay, we're going to set up new weapons factories because we don't have enough weapons production in Europe. And then the French will say, but only if 20% of the jobs are in France. And then the whole thing collapses again.
Yeah. That does make it tricky for them. And I wonder, I mean, I think we must also mention that the EU has achieved some very considerable successes. Most importantly, I think, peace for 80 years on the continent of Europe. I'm not sure that has happened before. That was pretty good. And then also the free trade. I think, that allowed the European economy for a while to grow very fast. The fact that you were able
Right.
to, have commerce across borders and have a shared currency, that helped a lot. But now it's at a point where it needs some changes to continue being effective.
The Brexiteer
Yeah,
in me is itching just to drag this debate into the weeds, but I will differentially resist.
Yeah, you see, I have these complex views on the EU, which is, I think, sort of in theory, like a big free trade zone and all these other things that it has, these kind of cooperation freedom aspects. It sounds great to me. Although I supported Brexit because I thought that the EU often acts far more as a sort of protectionist cabal for different
Yes.
farming interest groups rather than actually some sort of free trade zone.
Yes.
Although I'm not so positive about Brexit anymore because I think the Brits have really screwed up the transition. I think it was former Brexit supporter Daniel Hannan, who's a conservative lord, said that we've kept basically all of the anti-business regulations from the EU while losing all of its benefits. So, Britain has managed to work itself into getting the worst of all worlds, which is...
And I must say, I think what's important to realize is two things. That Maastricht really changed things. I think the EEC, the European Economic Commission, was decent. And it was essentially a free trade zone. It made barriers across the European continent really minimal. And had it remained that, I think it would have been, Brexit would never have happened. And I think the other important issue that is sort of a real difficult knot of our time to deal with is NATO. Because much of the post-war peace preservation was incentivized by the Cold War and the presence of NATO resources and a very active positioning of the United States on the European continent, essentially until the German reunification. So I think
you basically had an outside referee to kind of manage.
Exactly, and an outside referee with no tact and no respect for 1,000 years of history, which was essentially what was needed on the European continent. So what we're dealing with now is that, in a way, we're in the worst possible situation where NATO is now weaker due to a chronic European underinvestment, due to a resurgence of American isolationism. And so that NATO pillar of post-war peace has sort of crumbled, or is crumbling, or is at risk. And the other one is that the trade area that the European Union promised initially, or that the European Union's predecessor promised initially, has essentially become the opposite, where it's an isolated market with competition not on value for money, but on political leverage at a superstate level. So both of I think the benefits of a united Europe, both in terms of trade and military sort of protection against what it forces might fit in the peace. We are living in a unique period where the two pillars that actually preserved the prosperity from the Wirtschaftswunder all the way to New Labour, they've crumbled, and I think the problem for the Europeans is that I don't think they exactly know where to turn, because America, I think that the Trump phenomenon will be with us for probably as long as the Reagan phenomenon has been with us. It will long outlast his presidency, either through its presence in Congress, or through presidential candidates or gubernatorial candidates trying to recapture the Trump coalition. So that politics will remain active, whether you get a President Vance or a President Rubio. And also you have to have a problem of where does Europe go? It doesn't really have allies in South America, so it makes sense that it turns sort of to Africa and perhaps Australia. And Hermann working hard for another pay rise. What do you mean another pay rise?
Still working on the first one there.
It's not going well, I can tell you.
Okay, so I will say this. I'm a pretty big fan of the post Cold War order for the most part. John, with all of its warts.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the disruptions to that order has not been something that I've thought has been particularly good, with one exception, and I think this is unambiguously a positive, is that, and I think Europe is the place where you see this the most, but it's true of so many kind of global institutions, this feeling of almost extreme bias to the status quo, this overwhelming bias to this is the way things are, and this is the way things must be forever.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything good comes out of this current period, I think it's going to be that has broken up. Is that, and this is probably the best feature of Trump, is that he doesn't say, and I always think of his first-term decision to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. It's this sort of bizarre shibboleth thing born from the 90s or 70s or even earlier that the entire Arab world would be set aflame if you did such a thing. And then he did it, and no one even talks about it anymore. No one cares.
Yeah.
Because it was and so this sort of reshuffling of the deck does provide opportunities for institutions and countries that are willing to adapt to different changing circumstances to take advantage of it. If the EU reforms in a positive direction, it comes good. If South Africa develops a coherent foreign policy that is suicidal, then also it will be good. You'll take on all that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And we had another internal talk a few weeks ago about Dutch politics. And for me, the most interesting observation there was that our speaker said, we keep changing a government every 2 years because the coalitions keep falling apart. But we don't get different results. So voters are now learning that, whoever you vote for, life continues as before, and the government bureaucracy keeps managing life as before, and the regulations stay the same, and the laws stay the same, and the EU keeps its eye on everything and its finger in every pot, making sure that nothing changes. But what is the consequence of that on the mind of the voter? As a voter, I think you just become more and more frustrated, and you say, but this is not what I wanted. I actually voted for whatever party because I wanted to see something different. And that's not being delivered. And the consequence of that probably is going to be sort of this rising amplitude of extremism, where voters vote for more extreme parties because they say, but I do want something to change. Please let something change. And I think Trump is a reflection of that, because he is disruptive in that sense. And Europe doesn't seem to have found that mechanism yet. And the fear here is that by the time somebody comes around, be it in Germany or in France or in the UK or in the Netherlands, to actually be as disruptive as that, they will be very extremist. And then you have sort of the double downside, where you don't just have the status quo, the positive aspects of the status quo being overthrown, but quite a lot of bad stuff coming in as well. And so, that's the risk with disruption. You get some bad, you get some good, and you don't always know what you're going to get.
I promise you, I haven't suddenly been cast in Schindler's List or a BBC period a flashback scene. It's just that suddenly the weather has become quite overcast. But I just quickly want to make a point there that the EU and the ANC face a similar sort of problem in dealing with popular frustrations. Or at least public frustrations, in the sense that if we think back to the financial crisis about 15 years ago now, 17 years ago now, one of the EU's most sort of appreciated functions was really in stabilizing Greece and Italy in terms of their debt situations. They were the teacher in sort of that could break up these sort of petty group projects and say, oh, you're now prime minister, you're prime minister, we'll do this. So there was this supranational safety valve that the EU could be, but the EU's ability to do that must come with the ability to suppress national politics, because that's essentially what people wanted from the Eurozone wanted. They wanted Greece and Italy to get their houses in order. And even the Italians and the Greeks wanted that. But that ability to interfere in national politics is what likely gave rise to Brexit and then reform, the AFD, Geert Wilders' party, Marine Le Pen, to the extent that you've got a very interesting horseshoeing of the traditional left and the right. What unites these two ends of the horseshoe in European politics very much is a frustration with the status quo. They don't care whether you really drag it left or drag it right. They just want you to drag it somewhere, because the stagnation has become, I think, perceptible in economic results and the material circumstance of ordinary people. And that's where I think the ANC's reading of its own situation is predominantly ideological. We lost to the left. No. You lost to parties more radical than you because of the frustration of this dominance that has, in a way, suffocated and suffocated and saltified, sometimes to the approval and sometimes to the disapproval of the public, this shifting imbalance of liberty.
Just to add to that, that sort of ANC, EFF, MK bloc did still kind of lose. If you take all the sort of chunks of that coalition, they're kind of around 2/3-ish. You add, I think, like the ATM and the PAC as well to that, you get sort of just around 2/3 of the vote in South Africa. And yet that is down. There was a time when the ANC by itself, without any of those, was, back in 2004, was clearing that 2/3 thing. So that bloc still actually did shrink in an important way.
And I think
Herman, you've used the wrong mic. It's switched onto the wrong mic.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, that's better.
The fascinating thing about radical politics or sort of insurrectionist or disruptive politics from Trump to Le Pen is that they're not really traditional left or right. They are just that is, I think, why the drain the swamp idea was so popular. That is genuinely what people want. They feel that the administrative branch of state has been this stifling factor in their material circumstances, and that's the risk for the ANC as well. Its dominance incumbency comes with its own set of sort of biases that become so entrenched that you can't them.
And look, I think this is far too a broad topic to really get anything into now. But I do think that it's not just issues like economic cost of this or that, or immigration, or any of these other phenomena that is driving some of this excitement for things against the status quo. I do also think that there are sort of complex cultural currents going on around the world as well, to do with how rapidly society is changing from all sorts of things, mostly technology. The technology is driving radical changes to literally everything you can think of, from how we shop, to how we live, to how we date, to how we have children, to how we interface with the media and the news, to like almost anything you can think of is being radically shifted. And that is not something that the human mind, I think, particularly enjoys. And it feels very much, I think that adds to the sense that something is very wrong. I mean, there's this phenomenon. I know I said I wouldn't get into it, but I'm getting a little bit into it. There's this phenomenon that is popular amongst some people online. They talk about in-shitification, I think is the term. The idea that tech companies, because of the incentives, they start and they offer a really great product, and then once they achieve market dominance, they reorient the product from being consumer focused to being advertiser focused, which causes a huge dip in the quality of the service. But because they're so big, and because social media networks rely on sort of size and mass to be valuable, they keep their customers sort of trapped in. Now, whether that's true or not is a different question. There's a perception that that's true. And that sort of sense that everyone at the top is screwing everyone down below, whether it's true or not, is definitely a part of this whole mix. John, I think we've gone quite long now. Do you have something wise to say to kind of wrap this up?
Well, you set quite a high bar, I think, for sort of final remarks that can achieve that. But I think I'll pick up on a comment from one of the viewers. Let me see if I can just find it quickly. So it was somebody who was hopeful, and I think that's the kind of attitude I'm going to take into the next year and the next few years. As much as there is anxiety being induced by the disruption in South Africa and the rest of the world, I think it also creates opportunities. And South Africa, as I said, I think has maybe even better opportunities than many other places if we make use of them. So if you are able to imagine in your mind that South Africa starts giving ironclad guarantees for property rights, starts moving away from race-based laws, starts making the environment really attractive for investors, I do think that the South African economy can fly and that this can transform the lives of ordinary South Africans. And that is what we are trying to achieve at the IRR, to get people to see that possibility and to get the decision makers to make the decisions that make that possibility become a reality. So that's my wish for 2026, Nick.
Yeah, no, I'm totally on board with that. I think we are in a unique position where if we open our sails, so to speak, we can catch a very powerful wind right now. Now, unfortunately, South Africa, I think, has a habit of often missing these global winds. We caught, well, sales were a little bit unfurled at the commodities boom, so we sort of caught them kind of, and that's like the momentum we've been living off since that happened. But we have another opportunity to do it again and change South Africa from being, the sort of tallest of the poor countries in terms of kind of our functionality. We're better than Mozambique, but that's not a position that anyone should really, aspire to be. That's a very low bar. We're in a position to really, I think, become something far more successful, important, dynamic, and it's going to take us making the right choices. Any final thoughts, Hermann?
It has just started raining quite heavily here, but I think I caught most of what you said, and I think you've come to me because an awkward silence sort of just descended, so I'm going on a limit of prayer here. What I would urge people to do is appreciate that the severity of South Africa's problems are disproportionate to their complexity in many ways, that we can solve them and make great advances, where elsewhere in the world, I think that is inverse, where the solutions are harder to come by and the benefits won't be as material. So that's the reason I'm hopeful, is I'm seeing a pathway to great changes from solving problems that are imminently soluble. And that's sort of, in a way, what's behind the idea of what SA can be.
So I think what you just said fits very nicely with the raging storm. You can view a raging storm in two ways. You can view it as a portent of destruction and dark times, or you can view it as a sort of cleansing and rejuvenating time. And I think if we make the right choices as South Africans, and I'm optimistic we will, that's definitely what the difficulties of the current moment will bring us. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We hope you enjoyed this show. There will be an episode of the podcast report out tomorrow. But in terms of the Daily Friend show, normal stuff, this is our last episode for the year. So I hope that everyone has a wonderful Christmas, December break. Those of you who don't have a break, my condolences to you. I think this is the most wonderful time in South Africa. December is truly the greatest part of being a South African. And so I hope you all have a wonderful and happy new year, and we shall see you all in January. Cheers, everyone. Have a great year.